The next 20 minutes or so I'd like to talk to you about arterial wave velocity. This may be familiar to some of you, it may not. It's a measurement of arterial stiffness, which I think is very important, and it also, of course, becomes a determination of a patient's risk of a cardiovascular disease. And I believe it also provides evidence of supplements and protocols that can improve the stiffness index, and we'll be seeing some of those today. And of course, it's a diagnostic measurement that's ideal for preventative and anti-aging medicine. Now, it was actually Thomas Sydenham, who I believe was a forerunner to the Royal Society of Medicine in the 1600s, who stated that a man is as old as his artery. And obviously he was a gentleman who was well ahead of his time. As we will discover, arterial stiffness can now be measured easily, and it is a measurement of the speed of the pulse wave velocity. Here is a published chart that shows that the higher the pulse wave velocity, the higher pulse wave velocities are associated with shorter lifespans. For example, a score under 9.4 meters per second fares well. This is the top line. These are folks who have pulse wave velocities under 9.4 meters per second. Because over a period of 140 months, 80% of these patients were still alive. Now, those patients who were measured at the beginning of this study who had pulse wave velocities between 9.4 and 12 meters per second also fared fairly well, with about 75% or so surviving over the 140-month period. But those with pulse wave velocities over 12 meters per second fared much worse, with only, as we can see, about 10% of them surviving over a 140-month period. Now, we use these approximations of measurement as advice. A patient, for example, with a measurement under 9.9 is in the OK bracket. By the way, anyone in the 6 or under bracket is in the super bracket. And a measurement of over 10 but under 12 is in the you really should be thinking about doing something bracket. And of course, anyone over the 12 measurement we ascertain is in the you should really be doing something. And by the way, anybody who's approaching 20 should be at hospital. And we have seen those folks. So let's just remind ourselves that whilst cardiovascular deaths have been falling since their height in the 1950s, as shown in the centre, that it still remains the biggest killer in the Western world. And in 2000, we can see it's still the biggest figure. Putting it another way, a Department of Health study here in the UK in 1999 stated that 18% of deaths before the age of 75 were attributable to cardiovascular disease, and that was followed by cancer at 17%. Now, here are the traditional risk factors associated with cardiovascular disease, as highlighted in the very famous and very large Framingham study, and there's also some suitably sound advice for old Father Time. And of course, today we appreciate there are many factors involved with cardiovascular disease. Now, unfortunately, we haven't got time to run through these, but I'm sure you've heard about most of these that are listed, and I'm sure we'll hear other speakers mention them in more detail. The bottom line is that when taken as a whole, it becomes complex to ascertain arterial stiffness. And there may be additional genetic, dietary and environmental factors that will affect a truly accurate diagnosis of a patient's arterial condition. So how can we be more precise? Well, we believe that the answer is using arterial wave velocity. We're currently aware of 3 machines on the market today. Shown here is a British version called CardioCheck, and this is the machine that we've been using in our assessments that you will see later on. Well, arterial wave velocity, let's just look at a little bit of background. It's been clinically proven in over 4 years of trials at St Thomas's Hospital here in London. And it utilises the technology of aortic pulse contour analysis, that's another way of saying the same thing, which is backed by more than 26 published studies over the last decade. The key output is the stiffness index. This is a marker of the patient's current arterial flexibility and hence cardiovascular condition. In addition, the patient's results can be compared against a clinical database of chronologically equivalent persons to determine their comparative vascular biological age. In other words, there's 2,000 patients have been studied across a wide range of ages, so whatever your score is can be compared to the average in the age group to give you a biological age. Patients like these because they can understand them. They can understand if their biological age is younger or older, and it gives them an assessment of how well they're doing. It's also, I'd like to say that it determines the patient's individual outcomes. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean it's a measurement of whether or not the protocols or products that the patients are utilising are working, and if so, to what extent. I believe this must be a key factor in anti-aging medicine, particularly as patients are meant to be healthy and presumably want to stay that way. So therefore, this kind of diagnostic is not just a measurement of sickness, but one of the extent of health too. Just spend a little time describing to you the method of operation of arterial wave velocity. Now, it uses the characteristic of the arterial pulse to derive the indices that are related to arterial stiffness and arterial tone. The pulse distorts the arterial wall, and the distortion travels at the speed determined by the stiffness or the elasticity of that wall. And of course, reflections then occur when the vessel changes in some way. The arterial pulse differs in different locations due to the wave propagation and those reflections. And of course, a good location to measure the arterial pulse is in a digit where it is easy to access. The method by which the non-invasive finger clip picks up the reading from the digit is known as photoplethysmography. This method has been established in other areas of medicine, and it basically measures the increase in the number of red corpuscles in the fingertip as the heart beats. Once this information is gathered, a mathematical algorithm is then used to calculate the actual pulse velocity. So just going back to the schematic, as the heart expels blood, it distorts the arterial wall, creating an arterial pulse. The arterial pulse starts to propagate throughout the arteries. At the finger, we'll see the pulse start to form. When the pulse encounters diameter changes in arterial bifurcations, it gets reflected back, and a large wave reflection is generated in the lower torso. And again, at the finger, the pulse continues to form. The reflective wave propagates back up into the aorta and then into the upper arm. At the finger, the reflected pulse now starts to appear, as shown in this other light blue colour. The direct wave and the reflective wave then begin to add up together. The result is the formation of two individual peaks, this one and this one. Finally, the completed digital pulse is formed, and at the finger, the final waveform will often look something like this: the first peak and the second peak. Now, just before I describe, I should have told you something there. Eventually, let's go back. Eventually, we see these two final waveforms, which indicate, if you will, the outbound wave and the inbound wave. By evaluating these 2 points of these peaks, we can determine the point-to-point time. Now, just before I describe what I mean by point-to-point time, here's another way to think about how arterial wave velocity determines the stiffness of the elasticity of an arterial wall. Now, this should be making waves, but it isn't, but bear with me, pretend that's making waves. When you throw a stone into the middle of a pond, you will first see the outward bound wave. Afterward, you will see the smaller inbound wave, and the speed of that inbound wave is largely dependent on the energy it has lost. For example, if that outward bound wave meets the edge of a soft mud, then the return wave is slower, because much of the energy has been absorbed by that grassy bank.